I hope that rule will be followed here. This is essentially, in theory of the lyric, my focus is on the Western lyric tradition from Sappho to Ashbery, and I deal there, explicitly deal with French, Italian, German, Spanish examples, along with, of course, English examples which predominate. But so what I'm planning to do this afternoon is sort of basically give an account of the arguments of that book, but with primarily American examples. I'm sorry for the professors of foreign languages who are here, who are not going to get the French or Spanish or German examples. This project originated in my fascination with lyrics' strange ways of addressing time, winds, urns, trees, etc., the dead, and asking them to do something or to stop doing what they're doing. So here are at least a few foreign language examples here with these examples. Poets calling upon a universe that they hope will prove responsive, and their demands often prove at least seductive for readers, even if time does not stop and the dead do not speak, and etc. But these moments are non-mimetic, they're ritualistic, they foreground an event of poetic enunciation in the present. And so the question that was really animating this project was, so what's at issue here? What do such strange ways of speaking tell us about the investments and the ambitions of lyric poetry and how we should approach it? So it's a project in poetics, not hermeneutics, which for me is an important distinction. I'm not trying to produce a theory that would offer new interpretations of poems, but to understand how it is they function, what are the conventions, strategies that underlie and animate the lyric. So I attempt to work out a general framework of a poetics of the lyric, sort of a theory of the lyric, in which attention to various aspects or features of lyrics that entice readers and make lyric distinctive is encouraged and not resisted, as I claim it has been, by one of the narrow models of lyric that have in recent years organized most approaches to lyric poetry. So lyric poetry has a long history in the West, but an uncertain generic status. The great Princeton comparatist Earl Miner concludes that it's the foundation genre of poetics or literary assumptions of cultures throughout the world. Only Western poetics differs. And for that, we can perhaps blame Aristotle, who wrote a treatise on mimetic poetry. Miner goes on to add, the first thing to be said of lyric poetic systems is that they are not mimetic. And we can argue that it's for quite contingent reasons, because Aristotle wrote a treatise on mimetic poetry as an imitation of action, and not on the other poetic forms that were widespread or central in Greek culture, that Western literary theory neglected the lyric until the Romantic era. Aristotle himself was thoroughly familiar with the Greek lyric. There are numerous examples of lyrics are cited in his rhetoric, for example, but he omitted it from the Poetics, I would maintain, because he viewed it not as a form of mimesis, but as epideictic, as like oratory, as versified discourse about what is to be valued, praised, or blamed, or praised or blamed. At any rate, because of Aristotle's decision, lyric was treated as a miscellaneous collection of minor forms, despite the flourishing of lyric in ancient Rome, in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance. And it finally was finally made one of the three fundamental genres in the late 18th century, when a more vigorous and highly developed conception of the individual subject made it possible, at least momentarily, to conceive of lyric as mimetic and place it back in an Aristotelian framework. It was an imitation of the experience of the individual subject. The Abbé Batteu's Principe de la littérature emphatically reinserts lyric in that Aristotelian framework of literature as mimesis, the mimesis of feeling, and lays the groundwork for the Romantic elevation of lyric to the poetic norm, or even very quickly became sort of the essence of literature. So history that M.H. Abrams sketched in The Mirror and the Lamp, from a mimetic theory of lyric to an expressive theory of lyric. Hegel offers the fullest exposition of the romantic theory of the lyric as subjectivity coming to consciousness of itself. The lyric poet sort of absorbs the external world, stamps it with inner consciousness, and then gives expression to that enriched sort of poetic inner life, that subjectivity. Well, that conception of lyric as the representation of subjective experience, widely disseminated and influential, no longer has great currency in the academic world, at least certainly not in the Anglophone academic world. And it seems to have been replaced by a variant which treats lyric not as mimesis of the experience of the poet, but as a representation of the action of a fictional speaker or persona. So in this account, the lyric is spoken by a persona whose situation and motivation one needs to reconstruct. That's become really a dominant model in the pedagogy of the lyric in the Anglo-American world, but not as elsewhere, certainly. But for example, in Helen Vendler's widely used textbook, there we go, Poems, Poets, Poetry, students are asked when confronting a poem to work out, the first step is to work out who is speaking, in what circumstances, to what end, and to chart the drama of attitudes that the poem captures. I think the most explicit theoretical account of that widespread implicit theory is Barbara Herrnstein Smith's account, and there we go, both On the Margins of Discourse and Poetic Closure, where she argues that lyric is an imitation, imitation of a speech act, in effect a dramatic monologue which puts on stage a character speaking to a defined audience or to him or herself. That becomes the general model of the lyric. The type of lyric is a fictional imitation of personal utterance, as she calls it. So it becomes a fictional imitation or representation of a real-world speech act. Since that conception of lyric as dramatic monologue is not so common in other parts of the world, it's pretty common here. I probably don't need to illustrate it, but I'm very taken by this quotation by John Crowe Ransom, the leading new critic, who really offers a very remarkable version of this claim. The poet doesn't speak in an assumed character. The first thing we do as readers of poetry is to determine what character and what situation are assumed, and there's the possibility of critical understanding, illusion, and enjoyment. And he concludes, this is the kicker really, that the poem may be said to be a dramatic monologue. Browning only literalized and made readier for the platform or the concert hall the thing that had always been the poem's lawful form. And lawful form is a very strange idea. So poems had always been dramatic monologues. That was the only lawful thing a poem could be, but we just hadn't known it until Browning came along and created the model for it, as it were. Now, of course, in the English tradition, a great many important poems are dramatic monologues, and that's, of course, what helps promote the model. And it's possible to read other lyrics in this way, too. But even in those cases, it's a model that deflects attention from what's most singular, what's most interesting in those lyrics, and puts readers on a prosaic, novelizing track. So the reader looks for a speaker who can be treated as almost like a character in a novel. Character in a novel. And then, stop here and get this thing back on. I'll try to restrain my gestures. Is that working? That's working. Okay. Character whose situation and whose motives one can reconstruct. So it's a model that gives the students a clear task, which is why it flourishes. But it's extraordinarily limited and limiting. I mean, it leads to neglect of the most salient features of many lyrics, precisely those features of linguistic features that are not to be found in ordinary speech acts, for example. So from rhythm and sound patterning to intertextual relations, for example, not to speak of things like apostrophe. But here's an example, it's a good example that illustrates, it's perhaps an extreme case, but it illustrates an important aspect of the appeal of lyric. Chieftain, if you can of Ascan and Caftan of Tan with henna hackles halt. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll leave it up there for you. So this poem gives us not a mimesis of voice, but voicing. I mean, for me, that's an important distinction. Vocal effects, voicing is vocal effects which tend to be inversely related to representation. That is to say, the more voicing there is in the poem, the less mimesis of voice, the less it's imitation of voice. So Gerard Manley Hopkins is a good example. Lots of Hopkins poems are full of vocal acrobatics, but which make it very hard to imagine who is speaking in what circumstance. You know, cloud, puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows, flaunt forth, then Chevy on an air-built thoroughfare, etc. Things like that. You can't say who is speaking there. We have no idea. Anyway, so the model of lyric as intense expression of subjective experience of the poet doesn't fit a great many poems, whether ancient or modern, and more important, leads away from the language of the poem to the experience of the poet, which a reader is supposed to try to reconstruct, but of course our attention ought to be focused on experiencing the poem itself as an event and not to discovering what the author might have experienced. That's one model. The dramatic monologue model also demands of readers a reconstruction, this time of the situation and motives of a fictional speaker, character, rather than the author. But for many poems in the tradition, attempting to work out who is speaking brings no benefits and obscures rather than clarifies what the poem itself is doing. I mean, even when it's possible to imagine a speaker, this orientation emphasizes the fictional dimension of the poem and neglecting all those ritualistic and musical elements that make the poem compel our attention in the first place. For many lyrics, there's no plausible empirical situation of speech. Many of Emily Dickinson's most famous lyrics present an impossible speech situation. So, I'll skip over that. I've been ad-libbing a little bit here. I need to compress. So we need to focus on what the poet is doing, not try to imagine who is speaking. So, but there's a different kind of structure that's apparent in a poem such as William Carlos Williams' famous poem usually called The Red Wheelbarrow, where here again, no reason to imagine a speaker character, to attempt novelistically to supply a context of utterance. I mean, you can do so, but if you think that the thing to do in reading a poem is to work out who's speaking, then you're going off on the wrong track. You're risk trivializing the poem. I mean, is it a gardener who's very proud of his wheelbarrow? Is it Hugh Kenner writes about this. So one reason for that. This is a wonderful quotation. Try to imagine an occasion where this to be said. Try it over in any voice whatsoever. It's impossible. You can't do it. And to whom might even if you imagine, to whom might the sentence be spoken? Not only is this. If you heard someone say it, you would wince, but hammered on the typewriter into a thing made, and this without displacing a single word except typographically, the 16 words exist in a different zone altogether, a zone remote from the world of sayers and sayings. And yet, of course, you do say it, you go through the motions, but art lifts the saying out of the zone of things said. It's not a mimesis of speech in any respect. Clearly, the spatial dimension is crucial here, revealing a structure not detectable if we try to think of the poem as a mimesis of voice. But it's a particularly interesting example because the line line and stanza, as it were, are still the functional units, not the page, as in concrete poetry. And we have two line stanzas. First line, and one of the interesting features of this is it has a regularity, but based on the word, which is not generally a unit of prosody, right? Prosodic units are syllables or morides, but not words. But, 3 words, 1 word, 3 words, 1 word, 3 words, 1 word, etc. Here, lineation seems to serve as instructions for voicing, for producing this poem. Though when you hear Williams read it, of course, he runs right over the lines and does not obey his own lineation. So we don't know quite how to work with that. But without rhyme or regular metrical schemes, the poem still succeeds in producing memorable language in an unorthodox it's an unorthodox, really kind of unfinished poem of praise. It tells us the wheelbarrow is incredibly important, but not why. And so we're caught up short there. But it's not a poem that you can't make progress in thinking about that poem by asking who is speaking or in what situation. So here, in a poem like this, there's resistance to both the romantic expressive model of lyric and its modern successor, lyric as drama of the attitudes of a character. The poem does not create a character making an assertion in a fictional world, but makes a statement about our world, even if it's a statement that we don't quite comprehend. We struggle to comprehend. An assertion of value places this poem in that epideictic tradition of lyrics of praise, but seems to stop too soon without specifications, or rather the specification of the chickens and the rainwater makes mysterious exactly what the claim is. So we puzzle over it, but we remember it. It's memorable. So for poems like this, a more promising theoretical framework takes the lyric as at bottom a statement about the world, rather than, as Jet mentioned, rather than as a projection of a fictional speaker and fictional world. That classical model, which model inherited from the Greeks, centered on lyric as public discourse about meaning and value, but made distinctive by its sort of ritualistic elements. And that's true for many modern poems. There's the Williams there. Here's a little Robert Frost poem. The Robert Frost poem is on your handout. I guess I don't have it on a slide. Nature's first green is gold. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. So Barbara Herrnstein Smith, who discusses this example, that's one reason I use it, because she cites it in On the Margins of Discourse, when she's talking about, in the context of her theory of poems as imitation speech acts, imitations of real-world speech acts, she admits that and I quote, the appropriateness of the conclusion is experienced without regard for the speaker's particular motives or circumstances. So she still wants there to be a mimesis of a speaker, but she admits that you're not going to make progress in thinking about the poem by trying to imagine who the speaker is or in what circumstance. That what's important here is the progression by which the gold of the first line becomes the gold of the last line, and where gold, the symbol of enduring value, becomes ultimately transitory, without imagining a speaker who is coming to this realization, something like that sort, which would be unnecessary novelizing. But my favorite example of the importance of, sort of good test case for the importance of avoiding the dramatic monologue is Philip Larkin's most famous poem, This Be the Verse, which again I won't read it aloud, but therefore I can read it aloud if I'm not embarrassed. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. I'll stop there for the moment. But so accounts of lyric as dramatic monologue don't really make little allowance for poems like this, which appear throughout the history of the genre, from Pindar, after all, Pindar's are the acme of the Greek lyric tradition, all public pronouncements about not only the victors of athletic contests, but the virtues that the members of this particular city, inhabitants of this particular city display or should display. Usually it has that kind of performative quality of like praising them for certain kinds of values. It urges them to adopt such values, etc. But poems like this seem to cast values in a new light, ostensibly to disclose aspects of the world and praise what should be noted and remembered, but they claim especially to offer in memorable form truths to be considered, absorbed, and repeated by readers. I mean, if this is Larkin's most famous poem, it's first of all because readers don't expect to encounter fuck in the opening line of a poem with rhymes and regular quatrains, maybe in an Allen Ginsberg poem, but not a poem of rhyming with rhyming quatrains. But it also claims to tell an inconvenient truth and proposes unexpected measures. Don't get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. So this is a poem that that offers an excellent demonstration of what's at stake with the dramatic monologue model, because of course it would be possible to treat this as generating a fictional speaker and a world, and to ask who is speaking, in what circumstance, to what end. And if we do so, the most plausible answer is something like, it's a drunk in a bar who's angry and misanthropic drunk in a bar who's complaining about his parents and the world in general and telling everybody what they should do about it. But of course, to read the poem in that way is to trivialize it. It would certainly be a loss. If you then are relativizing its claims to a particularly obnoxious individual whom you'd probably go out of your way to avoid if you encountered him, making them the assertions of a particular character in some circumstance. You're depriving them of any authority, depriving them of the authority that they implicitly claim by virtue of the rhythms and the rhymes that make the poem more than a rant. So to treat this poem as the discourse of a fictional speaker is to set aside as marginal everything that belongs to what I'm calling the ritualistic dimensions of the lyric, which more shortly, which makes this language that one wants to repeat or to recite. Of course, you also have the shift. If you're really trying to attach it to a particular fictional speaker, then you have some trouble with the final stanza where he suddenly begins to wax poetical, as it were. Man hands on misery to man, it deepens as the coastal shelf. Those two lines don't fit so well with the drunk in the bar. Anyway. Emily Dickinson, whom we credit with an especially fertile and quirky imagination, still produces such poems that are about making claims about this world. Hope is a thing with feathers, tell the truth but tell it slant, the soul selects her own society, and on your handout you have the heart asks pleasure first, at the bottom of that first column. Heart asks pleasure first. And then excuse from pain, and then those little anodynes that deaden suffering, and then to go to sleep, and then it should be the will of its inquisitor, the privilege to die. So trying to imagine a speaker would be a diversion from appreciating the poem. I think we don't have to ask who's saying that our heart asks pleasure. I mean, it's poetic discourse. It's the poet, for God's sake. It's poetic discourse. What we have is a poetic reflection on the propensities of the human heart, with a real kicker in the tail when inquisitor and privilege suddenly give us a judgment that's not so easy to attribute. Does this judgment belong to the heart? Does it belong to a speaker? It belongs to the poet, of course. But I'm led to, anyway. So if one takes this model as point of departure, this model of lyric as discourse, sort of ritualized discourse about the real world, as opposed to the discourse of a fictional speaker or about a fictional world, then one can develop a broader framework that recognizes the role of fictional elements, such as plot and character, fictional speakers, representation of events, while maintaining the primacy of all those other aspects of lyric that are not reducible to story. Starting with, most important, lyric's availability for reiteration and repetition. The positing of a fictional speaker character or a fictional world is an inappropriate general strategy or general model for lyric. But since the positing of a speaker and a fictional since the positing of a fictional speaker and a fictional world is pertinent to some poems, we need a model that allows for it by acknowledging the tension in lyric between the fictional, which is story and character on the one hand, and on the other what we might call song, or better, the ritualistic, while recognizing, I think at least certainly this is the claim of my claim, recognizing the ultimate dominance of song or the ritualistic as distinctive of lyric. Now that distinction between fictional elements and ritualistic elements I take from Roland Greene's post-Petrarchism. He's writing about he's discussing the lyric sequences from a series of related poems in which some sort of broad narrative is kind of tantalizingly offered, from from Petrarch to modern Spanish poets, Latin American poets. And there he argues that lyric discourse, you've got the quotation there, is defined by the dialectical play of ritual and fictional phenomena. The ritual element is first everything that can be construed as directions for performance. And the full play of its ritual mode, you have that, sorry, I'm gesturing there. There. The full play of its ritual mode, which goes well beyond prosodic elements to include rhetorical, semantic, and symbolic features. Lyric is utterance uniquely disposed to be re-uttered, and it offers a performative unity into which readers and auditors may enter at will. So that possibility of freely entering, as we repeat, is a crucial feature of lyric. It's often neglected in critical accounts. And lyrics are poems made to be uttered by readers who may come ritualistically to occupy the place of the lyric subject, the lyric I, when there is an I. C.S. Lewis, the great scholar of Elizabethan literature, writes he's writing about the Elizabethan love sonnet, that a good sonnet, like a good song, was like a good public prayer. The test was whether the congregation can join and make it their own. It does not matter who is speaking, and since there's no help, any more than O mistress mine. And the whole body of sonnet sequences is more like an erotic liturgy than a series of erotic confidences. I'm fond of that quotation. In fact, someone complained, I think one reviewer complained that I cited it too many times in the book. It comes back more than once. It's a good quotation, the erotic liturgy. It's what the sonnet sequences are. So I argue that central to the lyric tradition is this tension between the fictional representational elements and the ritualistic. This tension comes out especially clearly, of course, in the sonnet sequences that Roland Green is studying. If we're reading Shakespeare's sonnets, we keep struggling to figure out, who are the characters and what's going on. Is there a plot? What's the plot? And we keep getting all these other things. We keep getting rhymes. We keep getting elements of address, prominent sound pattern, repetitions, and so on, while trying to figure out all these metaphors. Something will be developed in terms of legal fiction, something else in terms of gardening, etc., where we're struggling to work out, well, who are these people and what are they actually up to? But when you are looking at individual poems, of course, the tension may not be so pronounced. It may simply be you may not have much plot or character at all. You may simply have, as in The Heart Asks Pleasure First, in other poems, you may just have statements about the claims about the world. So from the ritualistic perspective, the reader voices the poem, and the poem itself is the event. The fictional is what we produce when we attempt to imagine a persona or speaker and a world or situation of utterance, and past events are evoked then in the act of lyric enunciation, but characteristically, are subordinated in various ways to a present of enunciation. If you're taking as a point of departure, as a default model, shall we say, that conception of lyric, not as fiction but epideixis, then you can explore the characteristic ways in which lyrics incorporate fictional elements, whether identifiable speakers, characters, rudimentary plots, as in ballads, for example, or simply incidents made notable by their insertion in the fundamentally hyperbolic space of the lyric poem. You have on your handout an amazing little poem by Emily Dickinson that illustrates for me the possible operations of lyric. She's risen to the challenge of writing a poem about nothing. A thought went up my mind today that I've had before, but did not finish, some way back. I could not fix the year, nor where it went, nor why it came a second time to me, nor definitely what it was, have I the art to say. But somewhere in my soul, I know, I met the thing before. It's just reminded me, 'twas all, and came my way, no more. Again, poem, no content whatsoever. It just was a thought that she recognized but has no idea what it was or why or etc. or when. So it's a poem that obviously could be read as a meta-commentary on poets' Vedic pretensions, as though any poetic thought would necessarily be significant and worth striving to preserve. But if if the poem's making fun of that assertion, that assumption, it also shows, of course, that even the most evanescent thought that can't be specified at all allows the self-realization of a poem. The thought itself is not invested with significance except as the occasion of a poetic event, created above all by the stanza form, which is more impressive for the nullity of its referent. I think in some ways, that's a little poem is sort of paradigmatic for lyric in its exploitation of language's ability to make much of nothing, even as it sort of slyly mocks that procedure. But it's a poem that helps to justify my otherwise strange claim, which doubtless people will ask me about in question session, that there is an underlying hyperbolic character to lyric. It's part of the conventions of the genre, for even the most modest poems. But this is a poem that also it gives us a past incident pulled into the present of lyric enunciation as we try to deduce its significance. It's a major lyric structure. Lyrics that remain entirely narrated in the past tense are actually not very common prior to the 20th century. In the Norton Anthology of Poetry that I looked through, only 123 out of 1,266 poems are in, less than 10% then, are in the past tense, and 21 of those are ballads, that's what you expect. If you think about Shakespeare's sonnets, only 2 of the 154 sonnets remain in the past throughout. There's always a pull into the present with an address, devouring time, blunt thou the lines for, or some moment at the end in the couplet often. There should be, as there's usually some present tense conclusion. Poems that remain in the past throughout either become allegorical, as in something like I heard a fly buzz when I died, or as in many 20th century poems, presume that the reader can imagine the present significance of an incident. Theodore Rutke's well-known My Papa's Waltz, which is on the handout, I think I don't have that on the slide either, it's only on the handout, is one such. Whiskey on your breath, it's entirely in the past. Whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pan slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. And then skipping to the last stanza, you beat time on my head with a palm caked hard by dirt, then waltzed me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. So one of the reasons I quote that, Barbara Bernstein-Smith cites this one too, as an example of what she calls the pointless anecdotes that suffuse modern poetry. Anecdotes of which the only point is, this is the kind of thing that happens. And that she suggests that the paradoxical effect of what she calls this, the non-assertive conclusion of such lyrics, the failure to indicate the significance of the events, is in fact to heighten the importance of what is presented, even if that significance is left for the reader to imagine. So for me, this example, this poem that when you get a poem that remains entirely sort of representational, shall we say, representational account of a past event, that's in some ways odd, and we have to think about what that illustrates, what that means. If Wordsworth had written it, he might have had a final stanza in which he said, "And now oft when on my bed I lie, I remember how he hit me on the head, and I," etc. But Rutke doesn't take that step. Take that appropriately Wordsworthian step. So. Present tense and the present of enunciation are central to lyrics in all languages. We have apostrophic poems that call upon something or someone. We have poems of definition that use the simple present. Hope is a thing. Hope is a thing with feathers. The thing with feathers. Hope is the thing with feathers. But in English, and make claims about the world in English, we have this especially distinctive lyric use of the simple present. I mean, lyrics use a special non-progressive present with verbs of action to incorporate events while reducing their fictional narrative character and increasing their ritualistic feel. I'll give you some examples here. It's better to give you examples here. Like, I sit in one of the dives of 52nd Street. I taste a liquor never brewed from Sankard scooped in pearl. I walk through the long schoolroom questioning, etc. that in both colloquial and formal English, such action verbs require the progressive form. I am walking through the long schoolroom, or I am tasting a liquor of never brewed, if there's something happening in the present. And if it's not progressive, you expect some kind of temporal indication. Right? I often sit in one of the dives of 52nd Street, or every Thursday I taste a liquor never brewed, something like that. I taste a liquor never brewed, whenever I get a chance. That's a better example. Right? So it's the combination of the simple present and the lack of temporal specification with action verbs that makes this a distinctive tense in English. And if you hear one of these, you know that either it's a poem or it's someone who hasn't quite mastered English. And this is the sort of, I taste the liquor never brewed. I walk through the long schoolroom questioning instead of I am walking, or etc. These lyric presents are not gnomic presents of general truths, which can use such verbs of action. A rolling stone gathers no moss, for example. But they lift us into that special poetic register of something that, as I said earlier in that earlier slide, something that sort of has happened, not exactly habitual, but it's something that you don't know quite what verb to use to describe it. Something that has happened, is happening. It's something that happens in general in that strange time of the lyric now. So, for instance, Frost stopping by woods presents a. I do have a slide, of course. There we go. Stopping by woods presents itself as a dramatic monologue. Right? We need to imagine a fictional speaker who stops in these woods, who delays the fulfillment of obligations to watch them fill up with snow. A curious feature of this poem, which opposes nature, woods, snow, and death to the human world of promises and obligations, is that the norms and values of the human world are delegated to the horse. My little horse must think it's queer to stop without a farmer. So then we're told he gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. And so here we have something other than observation of an event by a speaker. We hear a different note. A speaker describing what is happening now would say, at a given moment, would say he is shaking his harness bells. He's shaking his harness bells. But Frost's formulation introduces a distance from any particular fictional moment and marks this as a different kind of discourse, a sort of a ritualistic act not tied to a specific observable moment. We still need a speaker, of course, but the special temporality of this utterance moves us into a different discursive region. And what makes this poem more than an anecdote is the simple present on the one hand, and on the other, the repetition of the final line, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. As critics always note, that repetition moves us, anecdote and all, into a sort of figurative poetic register. So I think one reason for not treating this as a dramatic monologue is that we do not feel that we are being invited by the poem in order to pass judgment on, to evaluate the speaker and his attitudes, as we would if he were a character in a novel who drove into the woods and stopped and his horse was impatient, but he was musing on the depths of the woods. He would be a character, and we'd be expected to decide what we thought of his attitude and what we thought the author thought. But we don't ask that question about this. We don't ask what Frost thinks about this speaker. We think of it as poetic discourse. But let me move on. My time is almost out here from the question of lyric time. I'm not, the project in general, I'm not trying to tell people how to decide whether something is a lyric or not. How to decide whether something's a lyric. I start not from a definition, but inductively from a series of sort of hyper-canonical Western lyrics of the Western tradition and try to identify some of their salient features. I take the concept of lyric to be a historically evolving one, and based not on strict boundary conditions or on essential features, but on prototypes, which is one possibility for definition of concepts, prototypes. Lyrics are poems like this or this. We have prototypes. We have, for example, most of us actually operate with prototypes for many categories rather than with strict boundary conditions that that the chairs that you are sitting in here are a better example of a chair than a dentist's chair, for example. The dentist's chair is still a chair, but it's not sort of what we think of when we think of a chair. These are much more normal chairs. Or, a fire engine is a better example of red than a red hair. Actually, fire engines are no longer red. They are yellow. But Chip Tucker's vest is a better example of red than red hair. It's a good prototype for red, so we know what we're talking about. Red is color, things like that. We can't draw the boundaries that tell us where red stops and something else ends. So the question is, what are the issues that arise in from these poems? What are the parameters on which they differ? I take it as a working hypothesis that there is a lyric tradition, and that an attempt to understand it and the central features of poems within it is crucial, not only for reading and appreciating the poems themselves, but also for understanding the revolts against the tradition and consequent modifications and expansions of it. So I should say, I don't really have strong views about how much contemporary poetry ought to be considered lyric or read within that framework. It's a question, of course, as to what extent is reference to the Western parameters of the Western lyric tradition presupposed as something to be cited, parodied, denounced, or worked against, or does thinking about a poem in relation to the lyric tradition enrich that experience? There's certainly a broad array of poems that resist the lyric model, that resist being related to a figure of voice or ritual utterance, or to inscription made to be recited. These range from shaped poems, and concrete poems that you can scarcely read, can only be seen or described, to poems that refuse in other ways a relation to voicing and an enunciating reader, subject or reader. Poems for which, especially, one rule of thumb, poems for which the page is the unit rather than the vocalizable line. Much language poetry, for instance. Charles Bernstein's example. I'm willing to grant that Charles has managed to evade the lyric tradition by writing this poem. It's a poem. It consists of a blank page with the margins there to show you that this is really supposed to be a blank page, and that it requires to be read by other models. In any case, so I do think that quite a fair amount of contemporary poetry does achieve its effects by engaging the lyric tradition, and I'm offering in conclusion the, to me, very intriguing example of This Room, which is John Ashbery's poem, a poem from the opening poem of his volume, Your Name Here. Do I have that on the slide? No, that's something else. Okay, no, it's just on the handout, This Room. The room I entered was a dream of this room. Surely all those feet on the sofa were mine. The oval portrait of a dog was me at an early age. Something shimmers, something is hushed up. We had macaroni for lunch every day, except Sunday when a small quail was induced to be served to us. Why do I tell you these things? You are not even here. The title, as I said, this room, it's the opening poem of this collection, Your Name Here. The title of the collection seems to allude to bureaucratic language practices where you put your name here. Everywhere all being interrelated by publicity, by bureaucracy, or etc. But the poem connects the problem of sort of singularization and iterability with the characteristic deictic effects of lyric. This room, this stanza, etc. Where you as you remains unlocated. It can be us, it can be his lover, it can be whoever. Why do I tell you these things? That's interesting. This is particular. I'm interested in this poem partly for the ways in which the tradition of lyric sort of recuperates the recital of past events. But this poem is unusual in both in the explicitness with which it foregrounds this relation to lyric address. Why do I tell you these things? You are not even here, which certainly could be taken as emblematic of the whole tradition of love poetry, right? Being told people. But also with its, I'm interested in the it's sort of rendering hyperbolic, strange modes of lyric recuperation. You can fit in things like, the oval portrait of a dog was me at an early age. But as also often with Ashbery, we're sort of induced to cast around for points of reference among literary or non-literary discourses, but especially literary discourses. So you have Dylan Thomas' portrait of the artist as young dog, or Poe's short story, The Oval Portrait, or portraits by William Wegman of dogs as people, etc. Things of that sort. The commonplace that after a certain time, master and dog come to resemble one another. The dog I've now come to resemble my childhood dog, or whatever. What most intrigues me here is this, and this is not very relevant to the theory of the lyric. But whenever I have a large audience gathered, I'm interested in thoughts, anyone who has thoughts about the quail, right? It's that involution of that formulation. A small quail was induced to be served to us. I mean, how do you induce a quail to persuade it? Do you hold a gun to its head? How is it induced? But anyway, this poem above all is exemplary in the conclusion, with a joking but deeply serious foregrounding of the structure of song and ode, as well as the tradition of the love sonnet. The final line could be taken to sum up the whole tradition of the not only the lover's complaint. You could say that studying lyric can be thought of as working to answer that question: why do I tell you these things? You are not even here. So just to resume very crudely here, I think it's crucial for any theory of the lyric to foreground those features of lyric that distinguish it from narrative, which now so dominates the field of literary studies. Whence a default model of lyric as non-mimetic, non-fictional, though it can incorporate ritual and fictional and representational elements in its fundamentally ritualistic structures. And since it's not fiction, we begin with the assumption that it's discourse about our world, those filled with strange imaginings, which we treat as figurative. I think it's very significant that for most poems, though, with novels, you can shift into or even short stories, you fairly easily shift into a sort of science fiction mode, that this is a story about a strange fiction. We know it's already a fictional world. It can be a fictional world that does not share or has different features from our world. But with poems, we have a certain resistance to that, so that the outlandish metaphors, etc., or the figures in Emily Dickinson don't lead us to imagine that this is any world other than the world of Amherst, Massachusetts. It's just that they're very weird ways of talking about it, and but it's not some other fictional world. The ritualistic takes many forms, from myriad types of repetition, sound patterning, and metrical structures, rhymes, refrains, to apostrophes that stress the moment, this now of lyric enunciation. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, etc. As the poem seeks to be itself an event rather than a representation of an event. I also think that the historical connection of lyric with song might provide a salutary corrective model for thinking about this form. With song, we allow ourselves to be seduced without much guilt by sensuous form, and to dwell in the realm of sonorous pattering without an insistent quest for meaning. But this doesn't imply that our discriminating faculties are somehow switched off. In our engagement with song, as we pursue our pleasure, we can develop considerable expertise and knowledge of what we like, what we don't like, sense of affinities among particular singers and composers or different types of music, without necessarily spending any time at all trying to interpret a particular song. I mean, all over the world, people sing English pop songs without actually understanding the words, often getting the words wrong. And even, we know ourselves, at least I have songs that run through my head from my younger days where I still have no idea what they're about. I don't know if I'm sure you're old enough to remember Procol Harum, yes, the whiter shade of pale. There's 16 Vestal virgins leading for the coast, and who knows? We cry out for life. Who knows? Usually the simple answer, if you don't know what it's about, is drugs. But it's drugs. But in any case, very song which I'm very fond, but I have no idea what it's really about. Or now they know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. You remember the Beatles Day in the Life, the Beatles song. But of course, there's so many Beatles admirers, they probably have worked out exactly why we're talking about how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. But in any case, now they know how many. Anyway. Okay, so I'm sorry, there's digression. But something comparable, so we can develop considerable expertise without spending much time interpreting songs, and something comparable ought to be possible in the realm of poetry, attending to our pleasure while also gaining confidence in our ability to appreciate whatever it is that's secured our attention. Poets do not demand interpretation of readers, but expect what Coleridge called poetic faith, that their statements require no supplementation, at least for the duration of a reading. So the duration of a reading is a lyric event, and I do have a final quote from Susan Stewart here that we should keep in view. She proposes that a sound of poetry is heard in the way that a promise is heard. It's an action made in speech, something that happens, that occurs as event, and can be continually called to mind in the unfolding present. So it's important that poems are not recalled as a fact is remembered, but are registered as able to be recalled. That's important. To be experienced or uttered again. Even if you only remember a few of their words, or only maddeningly just a rhythm. There's the promise of an event that can be reproduced in the present of articulation. And I think that's finally the value to which lyric especially ministers is a love of the sonorous phrase, the memorable formulation. Whether it's the expression of an attitude one explores in repeating, I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day, or whether it's I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed, or whether it's an elegant piece of empty sonority, like the moan of doves in immemorial elms. And these are phrases that, as Valéry says, create the need to be heard again. So found in songs are all sorts of phrases, especially memorable ones, which stretch the imagination, offering us reproducible experiences of pleasure and puzzlement as we speak them to ourselves, or occasionally to others, as we should do more often.
Are you willing to listen to some questions and answer them, sir?
I am. Yes.
Professor Culler has kindly consented to take questions from the audience on the basis of these remarks. I hope that you can...
Also happy to have answers about the quail. Thoughts about the quail. Yes.
You don't have to put a down payment on the quail in order to answer frame a question about something else. Will you call on people, or do you want an intermediary?
I'd rather have an intermediary, especially if it's you. I think that I'd be honored to have you serve as an intermediary.
Speak, sir.
Well, I was wondering if you could help me with William Carlos Williams' poem and the Stewart quote. How does what Stewart says help me to read
Yeah.
Carlos Williams' poem?
Yeah. The Stewart quote. Yes. Come back, Stewart. Yes, there we are. A promise.
So I'm trying to grasp the ritualistic aspect that you're talking about, and yet I think there's something else also going on in this poem.
Well, of course, this is not a particularly. She's talking about the sound of poetry. This is not a particularly sonorous poem, but I think so. I think and here the formal aspect, of course, has to do with its disposition on the page more than with a metrical relation, metrical form. So it's odd in that sense. It's moving in the direction of sort of concrete poem. So I think what's relevant in her quote to that is not so much the sound as simply memorable language, which offers itself for us to repeat. We don't. If you're interested in that poem, it's because you think it would be nice to say it over again, and not because it tells you, not because it records some event or records some even an action in the past. That it's something that can be repeated as a statement. That's a poem that probably you won't repeat unless you have a feeling about what it's telling you about the world, or the world as collection of concrete objects, they're disposed in space, that we are phenomenal. We dwell in a phenomenal world that is there for us, and that we should pay attention to it, just as the structure of the poem asks us to pay attention to that, something like that. But so it's the sound. This is not a poem where the sound
What happens is that-
Whereas Chieftain Iftucan of Azcan with Caftan of Tan and Henna Apples Halt is this something that happens. It doesn't tell me anything about. Well, that's we can argue about that one. I don't want to venture
Because what I meant
interpretation.
is that in the so much depends, there
Yes.
seems to be a kind of teasing anecdote or teasing importance.
Yes.
Not just,
No, it's certainly making a claim about the world for us, and it's yes. So and that's certainly that's certainly character. I'm arguing that's the